All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about Ashley Madison, um, a case study into marketplace morality. This is a sort of a review of this company's history, very brief, and some controversies got into that raised some questions about marketplace behavior, specifically online. So let's go through it. We're going to just cover basically three areas. We're going to talk about what Ashley Madison is, what the firm is. We're going to discuss the business, government, society, and the internet. That's a crucial part of understanding how we judge, ethics online, as well as whether the behavior a business has online should match the ethics of society in general. And that'll actually bring us to a broader conversation of business ethics, where we'll talk about the theory of morality versus amorality, and what are the ethical implications of Ashley Madison's business practices. Okay, so let's start. What is Ashley Madison? And we're going to go into a brief history, which also kind of talks a little bit about the cases themselves. So Ashley Madison's business, for those that do not know, it is a online social network / dating website. Provides a few other sources, but it's targeted to married men and women to have discrete affairs and encounters. They emphasize that discretion. It's a huge aspect of their business model, which also leads directly to ethical conflicts later. With saying like life is short, have an affair, and just promoting this type of attitude and behavior, it's just fundamentally controversial, right? Regardless of what their business practices are in any other sense, it is controversial because obviously marriage is a component of society that we agree matches our values, monogamy, things like that, matches spirituality and religion, and to break that trust and to pursue other romantic interests and whatnot is certainly problematic in the views of society at large, and certainly our moral philosophies. Okay, so Ashley Madison, beyond just being controversial in general, has certainly had a share of scandals. I'm going to talk about sort of two, although the second one branches off, although you could argue that the first one sort of branches off to some broader questions as well. So one of the big ones that came out in the late aughts, which was about, 7 years into Ashley Madison's history of operation, was this big SEC violation controversy, where two individuals that met through Ashley Madison, James Gansman and Donna Murdoch, were caught with some controversial, illegal, later shown to be illegal, insider trading. So Donna Murdoch would meet with Mr. Gansman, and he ran an investment firm, and he would never tell her what to do, but he would mention acquisitions that he was aware of, or basically just give her stock tips, lots of advice, lots of information based on things that were basically his private information from his firm, and then Donna Murdoch would act on those things. I do believe that Donna Murdoch ended up with no time in prison, and Gansman ended up with 13 months in prison, which is, I would say, arguably kind of a short period in time for this type of federal infraction. The scandal itself, certainly, it doesn't say a whole lot about Ashley Madison's behaviors, but it draws attention to whether or not the behavior of this firm and the moral questions it brings to society make it the target of people that want to be bad actors, right? So if you're already participating in antisocial behavior, or maybe what you might call dysfunctional behavior, right? Are you more likely to become and to take part in other bad actions. And what does this mean more broadly? In other words, when you're participating in like the global finance capital market, which is highly regulated, when you're able to sort of find a discrete area where you can maybe bypass a lot of regulations and whatnot, does it create too much opportunity in a very sort of vulnerable aspect of our market economy? But the biggest by far controversy and sort of ethical crisis the firm had was the 2015 data breach. So hackers who were actually just targeting Ashley Madison due to their business practices stole more or less every single bit of their database. And it was about data on 32 million users, nearly 10 gigabytes of data. It was released on the dark web, but it was public. It was released everywhere eventually. It was easily accessible. It contained account details, email addresses, and payment information. People online took the database and put up their own websites where you could search the database and see if people you knew or people, your spouse or whatnot, or your parents, whoever was on the list of those users. And it actually, there was broader controversies related to people that showed up as users, but that's not really too relevant to this case specifically. So the first ethical crisis, of course, is whether or not this company could actually meet the standard of discretion that they promised to their users, which clearly not, if all the data was completely breached. But the other ethical question came when hackers sifted through the data and determined that the vast majority of female user accounts on the website were in fact bots. Bots refers to basically algorithmically generated user accounts, and these accounts were under the control of Ashley Madison employees. Initially, it was thought to be over 90% of the female accounts. Later on, it was reduced drastically to where there was maybe 12,000 actual women on the site, not active necessarily, but they were actual women. Actual people, and probably upwards of 60 to 70,000 bots. So still an overwhelming majority, but not quite that 90-95%. And what were these bots doing? Well, we don't have all the code that was being utilized. However, it's pretty much widely understood that they were using data collected on behavior to have the bots target and chat and engage men when they knew they were most likely to, make financial transactions on the site. So even though this type of behavior is not regulated, so to speak, it's not necessarily illegal, it's not even necessarily fraudulent, it certainly is ethically questionable. All right, so that's going to lead us to the broader discussion here. So just to start, BGS, or the Business Government Society and the Internet. So just the basic understanding of this relationship and where the Internet fits, because this is going to give us really the basic concept of how do we know what type of behavior is acceptable or not. We're going to go over three basic models really quickly. The first one is the most important. It's perhaps the first model that exists when we look at actual sociology, and that's the market capitalism model. This is sort of the model that's widely accepted as being a part of business as usual, so to speak, where business is sort of a fluid component of society, and the buffer between society and business that creates or reduces the chance for catastrophe and crisis is just the market itself. So the supply, the demand, whether things happen that are without, way outside the boundary of social acceptance or social values. However, it's worth mentioning that market capitalism is sort of a utopian classical economic idea from Adam Smith. It doesn't really describe, or was never really designed to describe, actual real world and sort of environments of the relationship. But But the main takeaway is that there's this general idea that formal informal institutions should leave markets unregulated, untouched for the most part. And we get this concept that business is sort of a convention, and we're going to get back to that a little bit later. It's worth mentioning really quickly the business government society dominance model. This is basically what a lot of people would call Marxism. It's a critical theory. It's the idea that business is made up of elite wealthy people, and that they extract value from the poor, and that they're basically sort of cowling the masses and in control of both formal and informal institutions. Formal institutions being, governments and social groups. Informal institutions being like maybe religious groups or even like, our sort of society itself, as far as our values themselves might be sort of controlled by business through, like, say, propaganda, for example. The main idea here, this is a structuralist concept, and structuralist concepts are not quite as dynamic in today's way of looking at the world. However, the main takeaway here is that the legitimacy of business and activities within business should always be questioned. We should always have an antithesis for what business believes they have the right to do, and what is sort of acceptable. While not the most widely accepted model, the stakeholder model is probably the most up and coming and model that has the most momentum. And basically, this is a concept that sort of creates what we would look at as business ethics today, because it talks about how actions of a firm impact more than just the owners or stockholders. So basically, we identify more groups broadly as being stakeholders. So internal stakeholders might be stockholders and employees and things like that. But there's also communities and governments. Broadly speaking, there's the environment, there's customers. By considering closely how a firm's decision-making impacts all these different stakeholders, we get a better understanding of which actions will or will not lead to an ethical crisis. And the general theory is that will actually generate more profit and value and operate more effectively when you function within a stakeholder model. So the reason why this is all important is because the internet falls into every single segment of business, government, and society today. Obviously, business utilizes the internet for profit. The big money on the internet comes from advertising, but a lot of it we might think of as being direct sales, whether it's like Amazon or whether it is platforms. Amazon is a platform, but as well as a direct seller, but eBay or Big Cartel, different places where we can sell stuff. Even Facebook now has a marketplace where you can sell things to, say, neighbors and whatnot. Government, not only did they sort of create the internet, they obviously gave it largely to business to be grown and changed. However, they still are in charge with regulating access throughout the world and regulating commerce online. However, the government has been very slow, ineffective at regulating commerce and business online, especially in the case of antitrust. That's not too relevant to the case itself. The main point here is that government is, in charge of this, but they don't really do it. Society comes in here, and that society broadly demands we see net neutrality, and that the internet be a public utility. So the social aspect is the internet should be used by anyone for anything as long as it meets the broader needs of society. That's going to have polarized reaction to regulation. There's been developments in children online privacy, COPA, which has created new issues, for example, with advertisement directly to kids or indirectly to kids. So there's constant demands and constant back and forth on what's the best way to go about, looking at the internet. So that brings us to business ethics, okay? And the basic discussion is moral versus amoral theories, and then we're going to go to the conventionalist ethic, which will bring us back to Ashley Madison, okay? So two primary theories when it comes to business, all right? And that is that business is sort of a aspect of society, and therefore the morals and values we have in society are an aspect of business, and they penetrate the walls of business. And therefore, to be ethical in business, you have to sort of be the same you would be in society. Now, that's not really the majority theory of how business should act, especially when it comes to large firms and corporations. Most of them, subscribe to what we would consider an amoral theory. It's the idea, and we'll hear this over and over again if we listen to owners of firms and the executive officers of firms. It's that business is governed by principles of conventionalism. That word again, where business is a convention. It's a system that was created by a society to achieve a goal. And basically, ethical behavior is anything viable within a legal framework created by that society. In other words, as long as the business is not breaking the law, their behavior is ethical. Okay? And that brings us to this conventionalist ethic. And this is really what governs almost all behavior by firms on the internet, including Ashley Madison. So that'll bring us back to the founder, Noel Biederman. He's argued that marriage is a social contract. It doesn't match human biology, and that anything his business does has sort of this broader sort of market need that it's meeting, right? That our social values don't match with how things should be, and therefore there's a market need to facilitate this sort of amoral interaction between married people, all right? And secondly, he said that he feels he should have the right, as long as he's following the rules, to advertise his product. So in other words, Ashley Madison, as long as it follows, rules and regulations, anything is viable business, okay? The thing is, formal institutions and regulators aren't very shrewd, and they're not very nimble, and they cannot address internet commerce fast enough. This creates a situation where bad actors have a tremendous opportunity to push social and regulatory boundaries. And opportunity is the number one factor that leads to unethical behavior within business. In other words, this type of philosophy, this conventionalist ethic, that as long as I'm following the rules, my behavior of my business, as long as I get positive outcomes for ownership, I've done the right thing, is extremely dangerous, because the behavior can be as wide-ranging as creating robots that can then pretend to be people. Okay, and we see this play out. We see a near constant news cycle of ethical crisis, normally dealing with online firms or firms that are operating online, and a lot of it has to do with these data breaches, but there's plenty of other examples as well. It's also led to this proactive consumer backlash, and a lot of this falls within the stakeholder model. We see that consumers are demanding more oversight. This has led to a lot of demands on Facebook and other social media sites, a lot of demands to review practices of Amazon, and maybe a lot of investigation of antitrust law to see if these companies are getting too big. So these practices result in ethical crisis, and they're going to go nonstop, basically until we actually have negative financial, outcomes, which seem to be rare for larger firms, or until we have the regulatory pillars put in place. And that's really it. So I hope to hear some good feedback, and thank you so much.